Okay, we should be live. We should be live. We're live? Fantastic. Okay. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. You know, this is the last online class for Tuf Shin Pei Beis, 5782. What an interesting year it has been. And we're going to conclude with conceptual walls and barriers. But like a nuance within a nuance, within a nuance. I have to tell you that in the yeshivas, they spend a lot of time on these couple of lines of Gemara. This is really it's extremely sophisticated stuff with a lot of differentiation, different opinions, different Rishonim and Achronim arguing about this. Here's what I'm going to try to do. I'm going to try to kind of synthesize and simplify. So instead of throwing all the different shitot, all the different opinions at you, I'm going to try to follow Rashi's approach, but I'm going to augment it with other approaches of the other Rishonim. And I'm just going to try to streamline it so you can actually learn something rather than hear a lot of things. Actually learn something. Now, today's episode in the Gemara, the Sukkah doorways, follows our previous episode, where we learned about the barriers, the walls of the Sukkah. And a key takeaway of the previous episode was that not every wall is a literal barrier. Not every wall is a literal barrier. Now, this is not unique to the Sukkah. This is not unique to the Sukkah at all. In fact, in Halacha, we have multiple needs for barriers or walls or partitions in which we use a non-literal legal halachic definition. Probably the most famous example is the Eruv. So on Shabbat, we are permitted to carry in a private domain. We are not permitted to carry in a public domain. So how do some people carry in a city like Toronto? We have an Eruv. Now, of course, it should be noted that when you have a biblical public domain, no Eruv in the world is going to change that. But when you have a domain which is non-specific, it's called a Carmelit in the Gemara language, so it's rabbinically proscribed from carrying items. In that case, there is mechanism that can be used, that can be employed to supersede the rabbinic limitations. And this is in general the meaning of the word Eruv. Eruv means a lot of different things in a lot of different situations. For our purposes, Eruv is a rabbinic mechanism that suspends certain rabbinic prohibitions. So there could be an Eruv in place. There's something called an Eruv Tchumen that enables us to walk a further distance in a non-settled or non-urban area on a day like Shabbat or Yom Kippur. Now the truth is that there is a biblical limitation. And the biblical limitation is very, very big. It's the size of the encampment of the Israelites. That was 600,000 people. That's big. But rabbinically, it's as small as 2,000 amot. An amma is 18 inches. It's not very large. So the rabbinic prohibition can be extended by virtue of an Eruv. And then we have something called Eruv Tavshilin, when you have a Yom Tov that is immediately followed by Shabbat, and you're allowed to cook on Yom Tov for Yom Tov. But rabbinically, it was prohibited to cook on Shabbat because you're not allowed to cook during a weekday. And if people would cook on Yom Tov for Shabbat, they might come to cook on Yom Tov for a weekday. So the rabbis forbade it, and the rabbis allowed a mechanism to permit it. Once again, that's an Eruv. And then we have the Eruv that most people are familiar with, to turn a Carmelit, which is a domain that is not public by biblical ordination, but proscribed in the same fashion by rabbinic ordination, an Eruv can help us supersede that. So when we talk about these kind of Eruvim, we use non-literal barriers. Barriers we can't see, for the most part. And the most famous non-literal barrier, though it's not the only non-literal barrier, the most famous is what's called Tzurat HaPesach. a doorway. Doorways don't have to be filled. Doorways can be empty. So, for example, if somebody has a yard and the yard is fenced in, and then the gate is open, or even if it's broken off its hinges, it doesn't turn the yard into a public domain. That's a doorway. A doorway doesn't take away the enclosure. Enclosures are entitled to doorways. Now the question is a doorway something that requires a lintel across the top, so you actually have a full archway, or is just a doorway, a break in the wall good enough? This is an interesting question. I don't want to dwell on it tonight because that's not the subject of what we're talking about here. We use non-literal doorways with regard to other things. For example, the Torah proscribes the mixing together of certain seeds. Non-kindred seeds cannot be mixed together. You're not allowed to plant them together. Now, biblically, the prohibition is to plant them together in what's called mapolis yad, literally to make a furrow and to place them in the same furrow together. But rabbinically, you're not allowed to plant them side by side. So if you have a fence in between, you're okay, because they're not side by side. What if you don't have a fence? What if you have an eruv? Does that work too? Just a tzuras haPesach, a doorway. So if you have it framed in a manner that makes it a doorway, yeah, it does work. And we have a similar concept with regard to the separation of a graveyard, for making like a barrier for a graveyard where a Kohen may go or not go. Typically a Kohen has to be at least 6 feet away from a grave, but if there's a fence, the Kohen doesn't have to be 6 feet away. He can be right there on the side as long as it doesn't come to touch the area of the grave. But if you create this barrier, then it's actually considered to be a wall. It's a barrier. So the Kohen can be 2 feet away from the grave as long as he doesn't stick his hand in, everything's fine. So there's just 3 examples of where we can use non-literal barriers. And of course, we're going to be introducing the same concept of doorways in the Sukkah to augment the non-literal barriers we've talked about already. And this, of course, is going to be a big question. And say, okay, one second. This is not unique to the Sukkah. It's not unique to the Sukkah. But then again, if these doorways comprise a barrier, why do you need walls for a Sukkah altogether? You just create a frame and put Chag on the top. Any cupola or proverbial chuppah, is, as long as the top is foliage, automatically becomes a sukkah. No, but it actually doesn't. It does not. You need to have some walls for the sukkah. Well, how does that work? Why is there a differentiation between the laws of Shabbat and the laws of Sukkah? These are good questions. And we're going to address many of these questions in the Gemara that we're going to learn tonight. As I mentioned, in the yeshivas, they make a lot of hay out of this Gemara. This is, real yeshiva students can spend anywhere from 12 to 30 or 40 hours going through all the different opinions and combing it through and trying to make sense out of all this. But we're just going to spend an hour. Just going to have a nice, like a sweet understanding, just the basics. Just the basics, which is not so basic. Now, I'm going to introduce this Gemara to you in one manner, in one approach. There's a machloket, if what I'm telling you now is fully accurate or not. But let's, for argument's sake and for clarity's sake, this is the way we're going to make it work. I'm giving a lot of prefaces, I'm sorry. I want you to understand the Gemara. So preface 1. In previous episodes, and if you've watched the previous episodes, you'll understand this well. By the way, if you didn't, you should. And then you'll have a good understanding of it. We learned that a sukkah requires some actual or literal walls and then can have a conceptual wall. We had a dispute whether it's 3 actual walls and 1 conceptual wall, and the Gemara erred on the side of 2 actual walls and 1 conceptual wall. And we said this is halacha l'Moshe miSinai. This is a special tradition that comes from Moses at Sinai, and it doesn't have to make sense per se. We don't have a source in the scripture necessarily, although we had a whole argument about how we could possibly source this back to the scripture and the different opinions about how this works. But that the concept of whether it's a third or fourth wall that's being talked about was a dispute of how we expound the scripture, of how we delve into and extrapolate the Torah's message from the cryptic words of the actual pasuk of the Torah. But everybody is in agreement that there is a wall which doesn't have to be literal almost at all. Almost at all. We said that that wall can suffice with a hand's breadth, a tefach. And then in last week's episode, so we said, okay, so where do you place that? How do you place it? Is it just like a continuation? Is it on an angle? Does it have to be like a corner? So we talked about this idea. And then we ended up in the alleyway. And that's where we're going to pick it up from tonight. So in the alleyway, in the first examples of the Gemara, we had an angular plane, an L shape, right? So we had these angular elevations, and the angular elevations require then an extension. So, for argument's sake, as we learned, if the elevation is on the east side, that's here, and on the south side, so you can have an extension either on the west, a beginning of the west, or the beginning of the north. That's the third side. Okay. Then the Gemara said, so what happens if you have an alleyway? And the alleyway has walls, because it's an alleyway, so you have walls in the alleyway. And I just put schach from wall to wall. Here's my alleyway, and I put schach going from one end to the other. Is that a sukkah? It has two openings. How many walls does it have?
Two.
Exactly. It has two walls. How many walls does a sukkah need?
3.
2 and a bit.
2 and a bit.
Right? You're correct. You're saying that you know 2.5. Actually, 2 and a bit. So, is a bit going to do it here? And the Gemara told us something very interesting. 2 things. Number 1, the tefach has to be an open tefach. And a tefach shochakas, which we said is like the fingers that are loose, not a fist, not fingers that are held tightly together, but fingers that are loose. So it's a little bit bigger, a larger tefach. And the second thing we said is it should be at least 3 handbreadths away from the edge of the wall, which means that it's going to be at least 4 handbreadths that are covered. There's something called lavud, which means that those 3 empty handbreadths are considered to be filled. Halachically, they're as if the break never happened. There's no fissure whatsoever, and that's 4. And if we have 4, it's most of 7, and 7 is the wall of a sukkah. So we have the most of the actual wall of a sukkah. And the Gemara came back and said, that's interesting. So when you have an L shape, even a tefach, even a hand's breadth is good enough. And here we need a larger hand's breadth, an open hand's breadth, and we need these 3 tefachim with a 4th tefach. What's the difference? And the Gemara's answer was very simple. The Gemara's answer was that when you have an L shape, so at least you have the beginning of an enclosure. That is an enclosure of sorts. But here, when you have a wall on the south and a wall on the north, you don't have any enclosure. You have an alley. So that's why you need more of a wall. That's basically bringing you up to date. And it's necessary to understand this before we move on, because we're going to learn, we're in the middle of page Zayin Amud Aleph, Daf Zayin Amud Aleph, which is about halfway down the first folio side of the 7th page of Masechet Sukkah. Rava, the great Talmudic sage Rava, is going to comment on what we just learned. Now, I do have a question here from somebody named Kimberly. She wants to know, I'm not sure what that means, the high priest of Ptah. I don't know what that is. Tara in Aramaic means door. That is called Tira. Yeah, Tira means door. Okay, I'm not sure what your question is, Kimberly. If it's relating to the Gemara, to the subject, I'll be happy to try and answer it to the best of my ability. By the way, if you're on Facebook, please hop onto YouTube, because on YouTube there's a live chat, and that way I can look and read it and try to answer the questions. So Rava says, and I'm taking the approach that Rava's comment is on the alleyway sukkah, although there is another school of thought that it might be on the L shape too. But I'm taking the approach that this is about the alleyway sukkah. Amar Rava said, proviso. 1 second, he said, hold your horses here. Don't think that it's just enough to have that tefach shechakas, that broad, that open tefach, that open hand's breadth, and then a couple of empty tefachim in between, so it's only 3, so it's less than 3, it's lavud. No, that's that. You also have to have the einon niteres. This sukkah would not be made permissible. Now the word nitar, niteret, literally means made untied. Like something which is asur, something which is prohibited, is called tied. Like the Arizal says, because you can't elevate it. It's tied up. The sparks can't be elevated. You can't eat kosher, non-kosher food, and then elevate the food by studying Torah or doing mitzvahs. It just doesn't work. But in order for something to be elevated, it has to be untied. That's the meaning of mutar. So here we're saying that the sukkah is not niteret. It's not made permissible. It's not untied, meaning untied from its proscribed or deficient state. You haven't redeemed it. You haven't released it. In order to release it, in order to make it, to welcome it to the world of sukkahs, it's only going to be niteret. It's only going to be redeemed or released bitzurat hapesach, when we have this doorway, this image of a doorway. Now the word tzura literally means an image or a picture. Like in Hebrew, an artist who sketches or paints is called a tzayar. It's called a tzayar because, or when somebody portrays an idea in a colorful way, he is mitzayer. He's sketching this panorama. So the word tziyur literally means the figure, creating the figure of, the outline of. So we need what's called a tzuras hapesach. A tzuras hapesach. Hello to Chad from Colorado and Mr. Flanchico, all over from Thornhill. This is very exciting. So what does it mean, the frame of a Pesach? I'm just going to give you an example that I think people can relate to in today's day and age. Art has become very suggestive today. What I mean suggestive is we don't necessarily sketch things out fully, especially like popular art or in advertising. They'll sometimes make a silhouette or an outline of something. Or sometimes they'll draw only like one side of an image. And you kind of know what it is. Like logos do this, company logos. You know, when the iPhone was just starting, they had this silhouette of like somebody dancing. It was called the iMusic or something. Like, it's just sketching things out. So today they sketch things out. We have an outline of something. It isn't actually a picture, but you know exactly what it is. Everybody looks at it and knows exactly what it is. You have the sketch of half a tree, and people know what that is because it has the image. It has enough. There's enough, shall we say, ink on the paper to get the message across. That's called a tzura. So it doesn't have to be fully. It doesn't have. It's a tzura. It's the image of. It's an outline of. Now, do we need a tzuras haPesach that you can affix an actual door to? So the answer is, for the most part, not. For the most part, not. It needs to be oimed beruach mitzuya, which means unless you get Hurricane Fiona or whatever her name is over here, then obviously it's going to be uprooted. But on a regular day, today was a little windy in Toronto. It's even a couple of little rain. That wasn't very much. It wasn't impressive. If you're putting up a tzuras haPesach that's going to blow over from today's wind, you do not have a tzuras haPesach. That's not an eruv. But if you have poles, they don't have to be very strong poles, but poles, and they don't need a lot of diameter. If they're made of strong material, they can be fairly thin. If you have poles and they're grounded, well grounded, and then you put even a fishing string across the top, even a wire, you have a tzuras haPesach. By the way, many of the eruvim today are made in exactly that way. So you have a number of poles, and then you have wires or string across the top. You can't really affix a door. They don't have to affix a door. You need a tzuras haPesach. So Rava says, yeah, this alleyway, we have 2 walls on either side, but they're parallel, not perpendicular. And because they're parallel, we don't have an enclosure here. So we're going to create some kind of enclosure, because we know halacha Moshe Sinai, that the third wall doesn't have to be a full barrier. It can be partial, it can be conceptual. There's a special halacha Moshe Sinai. It was like a big chidush, a big novelty. Wow, that's an enclosure? That's nothing. That's like a tefach, it's a hand's breadth. So yeah, it's a hand's breadth, but it's a hand's breadth that's positioned in a way that comprises most of what is already considered to be a sukkah wall, which is 7 tfachim, fairly small area. And because 7 tfachim, which is about this big, comprises a sukkah wall, so you have your tefach and you have your 3 empty spaces, which is less than 3, so it's like as if it's filled, and that makes most of 7 tfachim, most of a sukkah wall. It's an enclosure. That was a big chiddush. It's like, wow, okay, so that's halacha Moshe Sinai. This is what halacha Moshe Sinai is telling us, that we have this special law from on high where God said to us in the oral tradition, Kinderlach, you don't need to make a full-fledged enclosure to fulfill this mitzvah. Sure you should, if you can, but what happens under extenuating circumstances, as I mentioned in the previous episode? What happens? You do the best you could. This suffices. And then we push the envelope. And we said not only when it's an L shape, even when it's an alleyway. Okay. Now Rava comes along and Rava says, not so fast. Not so fast. You're going to have your tefach, but it also requires a tzuras HaPesach. It also must be in the image of a doorway. Now, what is Rava saying? By the way, not only don't we know what Rava is saying in just reading his words now, the Gemara doesn't even know what Rava is saying. The Gemara has 3 versions as to what Rava might have said. Unfortunately, Rava wasn't around for us to ask anymore. So Rava made this very important teaching, and this teaching is recorded, and now we're trying to knock our brains out and figure out what did Rava actually say? And then we'll talk about what the halacha says. Like, what do we do? Because we have a teaching from Rava, and it comes in three shapes. So what's the actual halacha? But first we're going to go through methodically the 3 versions of Rava's rule, so we understand the possibility of what he might be saying. Kimberly is saying, the question would be, to restore the temple, will the high priest redirect the Egyptian priesthood? Kimberly, I have no clue what you're talking about, so this is beyond my pay grade. I don't know. The Egyptian priesthood, ich weiß nicht what this is. We left Mitzrayim like 33 centuries ago. We're not going back. Okay. So right, let's go to Rashi. That's like the smartest way to do this. Rashi says, so Amar Rava, ve'ein neteres elo b'tzuras HaPesach. That's, they'll go give you simple 7 words there. But these are like, you need a lot of background to understand these 7 words. So Rava says like this. Forgive me, I can't see anymore. Okay. So Rashi says, be'eruvin, with regard to eruvin, and eruvin is talking about, of course, the barrier that's made for the Shabbat enclosure, which I've discussed already today at some length. Omar, so in Masechet Eruvin, which is the tractate that speaks about this, Omar we say, Heichi dami tzuras HaPesach. So what does this Tzurat HaPesach, this image of a door, what does it look like? Like, what does that mean, an image? And the Gemara there, this is on page 11, Masechet Eruvin says, very simple. Konamikan, v'konamikan, a reed is the literal translation. A pole, a standard, whatever. Like, something that can stand on its own. It's not paper mache. V'kona al gabeim. And there is a reed on the top. So we could be talking about some kind of pole. A pole on either side and a pole across the top. What do you call that image? If I had, let's say, a black piece of paper, and with white ink, I would draw a line, and another line. Yeah. And you know what? For extra credit, I'll give you lines on the bottom too. Okay, I'll draw lines across the bottom. You look at this and what is that? Archway, doorway. There you go. That's a Tzuras HaPesach. That's exactly what we're talking about. Tzuras HaPesach. It has the image of a doorway. Simple. So the Gemara says precisely that. Konamikan v'konamikan, ikonagabe, that's your image. Does it mean you have to actually affix a door to this? No, you don't have to fix a door to this. I don't know what this lady is talking about. Wells of Abraham. Okay. I'm sticking to the Sukkah. Kimberly, if you have questions about this Gemara and Masechet Sukkah, I'll be happy to try to answer them. We're not going to solve the world's problems tonight. So, this is what we call a Tzuras HaPesach. And therefore, now that Rashi established that, V'hocha, and here, Ka'omar Rava. Rava is telling us. The tefach sheshoninu bebraisa, that the tefach we learned about in the brisa. The brisa, of course, is the codicil to the Mishnah, where we had a brisa. You can't argue with the brisa. The brisa told us that halacha l'Moshe Sinai. There's a tradition that goes back to Moses at Sinai that one tefach is good enough. It works for a third wall. So Rav is saying that this tefach that says in the brisa, shemater bedoifen shlishis, that you can push the envelope, if you will, and create a conceptual, almost imaginary, but nonetheless legally binding barrier for the third wall. Eni matir, it's not going to work. It doesn't release it into the world of kosher sukkahs. El im kain aso laoso tefach tzuras haPesach. That tefach has to have the image of a doorway. How can a tefach, which is a hand's breadth wide piece of particle board or wood or rubber, whatever it might be, how metal, how could it be a tzuras haPesach? And Rashi says, al pnei kol hadoifen. It has to cover the entire facade of the wall of the sukkah. So you're saying, like, what does that mean? Ketzad. Rashi says, great. I knew you were going to ask that question. How does that look? I'll tell you how it looks. Kono shel chatzi tefach. Take that tefach particle, take that tefach wall, and divide it. So a tefach is 4 fingers. A chatzi tefach is 2 fingers. Now you take, this is significant, because typically when we look at the Tzuras HaPesach, it can be a very thin line. Now it has to be a little more substantial. It's got to be at least 2 fingers thick. And you'll place another chatzi tefach, kona shel chatzi tefach. So we're talking like a 1x3 or something. You know, so there's a width over there. B'ktzoy shekenegdei, v'kona al gabeihem mizelozeh, and then you place the lintel over them. So let's say a 2x4. 2x4 would be a tefach. It's 4. But a 2x2 would be a chatzi tefach. So you have 1x2s or 2x2s. And 1x2s are 2x2s. By and large, if they're anchored well into the ground, they could stay there. Or if they're added to your sukkah. But it doesn't have to be. You could use a very thin but strong reed. You could use a metal pole. But if you can use it for the sukkah, then it has to have that kind of coverage. And then we say, Haveleki'ilu kol hadeifim sosums. And we look at that wall, that whole facade, which is made up of a doorpost, if you will, on either side. And then a lintel across the top. And we say, that whole empty space, hear no evil, see no evil. It's not empty. It's filled. So you're talking about it's filled. It's not filled. It is filled. Halachically, it's filled. But I can see through it. You can see through glass too. Glass is a kosher sukkah. Seeing is not the only way to define a reality. That makes it a halachic barrier. Halachically, it's divided. Yeah.
Can you walk through it, though?
Can you walk through it?
Well, like, it's not a doorway, it's an imaginary wall, so to speak, but can you use it, can you still walk through it?
Can you technically or can you halachically?
Halachically.
Yes, you can halachically walk through it.
Okay.
But I'm going to tell you that being able to walk through or not able to walk through doesn't comprise whether something is a barrier or not. I'll give you an example of a modern day example. Today you can have electrical, you can electrify an empty area today. A wireless electrical area where if you go into a certain area you can get yourself into trouble. They can create an electric current. They have a frame, they can create an electric current and you're going to get burned going through.
Jake's question is,
Jake's question is,
this is a wall.
Right.
So I wouldn't dream of trying to walk through that.
Correct, but if there would be an opening in the wall that you could walk through, would it make the wall no longer a wall? No. It'll be a wall with an opening.
Yeah.
Okay, so you happen to have many openings, or you can choose your opening.
Okay.
Think of it as a soft opening. It's amorphous.
Fence, where there's an opening in the fence, even though it's still a fence.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
So your sukkah could be a fence, many poles.
Your sukkah could be a fence. Not only many poles, even many strings. If you put strings continuously one across, you taunt strings, rope continuously one across the other, that could be an enclosure, even though you can fit between them. So we don't define the reality of something by whether you can walk through it or not. It's still a door. It's a doorway. You can walk through the doorway. Doesn't make this wide open.
Okay.
Let me put it to you this way. Suppose that there was a rule that said no trespassing past this point. Trespassers will be shot, it says at that house in Texas or wherever people have guns. Technically, I think in certain states of the Union, you could shoot somebody if he trespasses on your property. I'm not sure if you get away with it, but it's as I understand it to be. So if there's demarcation, let's say there's a doorway. First of all, I saw an empty area, so I walked through it. Yeah, it was not a very smart thing to do because there was a big sign that says trespassers will be shot. And you walk through. So, but I mean, if you didn't really allow me to be there, you should have locked it up or something. So no, there was demarcation. You saw there was a barrier there. You decided to go through it. You know what happens if on the highway they have those red cones, and you decide, I'm just going through. There's traffic. Then you find that you drove into a sinkhole, maybe, but or maybe not. But the point is that those red cones legally represent a barrier that you're not allowed to go past. And a person could be given a ticket, a very significant ticket, for driving past those red barriers. Even though, if you didn't want me to drive, you should have put up a concrete barrier. Well, it doesn't exactly work that way. The law says that these red cones represent a barrier.
That happened to me.
It happened to you, huh?
The officer put them closer together. I would
Right.
have known, but it was wide enough for my car. I thought I could.
And what did he say?
He said, "Okay, bye."
Really? Let you get away with that?
Next time, yeah. Actually, it happened right here.
Okay, so here's the thing. First of all, it was the officer's discretion to let you get away with it or not. That was his discretion. And your point to him was it wasn't visible enough. It wasn't clear enough. And maybe it wasn't clear enough. But in theory, he still could have given you a ticket.
Absolutely.
Because in theory, those red cones said it means there's a line here, there's a barrier. So when we talk about barriers, we talk about walls, we talk about limitations, enclosures, we don't have to think in one dimension or even two dimensions. We have to be able to think conceptually. There's conceptual realities. Halacha is not governed by our vision, our sense of touch or taste. Say, this kind of tastes kosher. Yeah, it tastes kosher. But it's not kosher.
So halachically, according to Moshe Rabbeinu, we have two walls and a tefach, then
We have a
what's the
sukkah.
other discussion about? Everything else should be permissible. If you have the minimum necessary.
Actually, what we're trying to ascertain now is the minimum. What is the minimum? So Rava came along and said, yeah, and let's say we're talking about the alleyway sukkah, for argument's sake. The alleyway can be a kosher sukkah as long as there's at least a tefach of partition But now Rava said, yes, a tefach of partition, but not one tefach, not 1 2x4 going down. There needs to be a 2x4 divided with a lintel across the top. That's the kind of sukkah that's kosher. So we're qualifying. You're right. If it's an alleyway and you have a little wall, isn't that good enough? Yeah. But the question is, what does it have to look like? In our previous episode of the Gemara, what it had to look like was a tefach sheichakas, which is a little more than a tefach. And according to most opinions, that's a rabbinic addition. So we don't go less. And it has to have a space of 3 tefachim, so it together comprises 7, most of 7. And now Rav is coming along and saying, no. The tefach we spoke about, and according to this opinion, Rav would be clarifying / arguing, at least in our previous way of understanding this. He's qualifying. He's saying, you need to make sure you understand this. It's not the way you envisioned it previously. Those tefachim, that tefach has to be divided in 2, and it has to have a lintel across the top, because only when it forms an image of a doorway, only then is it a legal wall. But when it's just a 4 inches, that's not good enough. That's like, wow. That's a very, very different way of understanding our third wall in the alley. And again, this is Rashi's opinion, and this is not everybody agrees. There's a number of different ways of understanding the words. We're just going, today we're going to keep this simple. Do the KISS method. Keeping it simple. This is how Rashi says it. So that's what Rava is saying. Rava is qualifying. He's not arguing on a brisa. The brisa says you need a tefach. Rava says, of course you need a tefach. What he's saying is that the tefach has to be arranged in a manner of a tzuras haPesach. You have a question?
Wouldn't we need that in order to make the schach?
That's a very good question and a good point. And the answer is not necessarily, because the schach could be a little jagged on the edge. And as long as it would be within 3 tefachim, it wouldn't actually be resting on those 2 poles. So here he's saying that those 2 poles, A, have to have a certain depth, a certain size. B, there has to be something across the top, resting on those actual things. I just want to see if we have any questions here. We learned the minimum height, Skippy is saying, last year with the size of the Aron Kodesh and golden color. Beautiful. Yes, we did. Very good. It's amazing that you remember. We also reviewed at the beginning of this year. What was the sukkah size minimum? 10 tefachim, Skippy. 10 tefachim. That was the whole discussion. The wings of the cherubim, if we measure from the floor or from the top, as if from the lid of the thing, 10 tefachim. Okay? All right. So, this is the first version of Rava, as Rashi explains it. And again, I'm keeping it very simple. But I do want to address one basic question. I'm going to address it right here, even though the same question applies in varying ways over the next 2 versions of Rava's teaching too. If this concept of tzuras haPesach works everywhere else, without having a tefach, why here do we need to have a tefach divided? Like when you make an eruv, if you have metal poles which are literally a diameter of 1 centimeter, with a piece of string on the top, that works. That's already a tzuras haPesach, but it wouldn't make it a kosher sukkah. And ostensibly, the whole halacha l'Moshe Sinai was coming to create a leniency. This is a huge leniency to allow for the enclosure of the sukkah, the temporary dwelling, to fulfill the mitzvah. It's a huge leniency. It's not a leniency. This fits right into the rest of Judaism. Number 1. Number 2, what about the other 2 walls? What about the kosher walls? Why couldn't you make all the walls out of a tzuras haPesach? I mean, if you're talking tzuras haPesach, a tzuras haPesach is a tzuras haPesach. A shape of a door, that's a wall, so you're good. And nobody says that a sukkah can be 4 poles, a frame with schach on the top. Nobody says that. You never saw such a sukkah. If you did, it wasn't kosher. So how does that work? The basic premise is this. The basic premise is that not all halachas are created equal. there's a certain halachic definition which is required for barriers that are not meant to be shelters. They're meant only to be a barrier. So in Shabbat, it's not actually a shelter. Nobody's taking shelter in Thornhill. It's creating an enclosure. A halachic enclosure and a shelter are not one and the same. When it comes to the sukkah, we need to have what's called defones nikoris. They have to be noticeable. This is the words of the TISCH. The TISCH says these words. They have to be noticeable walls. In other words, it can't just be a legal conceptual barrier. There has to be some image of actual shelter. And if there's no actual shelter, then you don't have a sukkah at all. As we mentioned in the previous episode, 2 walls attached at perpendicular fashion is a shelter of sorts. Like for a soldier trying to shield himself, if he's in a corner like that, at least he's sheltered. He's got his back to the corner. He's now looking out to see who's out to get him. He's safe. That's a bit of a shelter. If you're trying to take shelter from a hurricane, being in a small area like that can provide you some shelter. It's not like being out in the open. So we said the 2 walls, that has to be real shelter. It has to be like real walls. And even those walls are somewhat conceptual, and there's liberties, but still there has to be walls. A sukkah without walls is not a sukkah. The 2 walls have to be kind of real walls. The 3rd wall can be mostly conceptual. But what Rav is saying is that even in that mostly conceptual wall, there still has to be some kind of appearance of a wall, or a wall that's begun. And if it's less than a tefach, we actually have nothing. So there has to be a tefach. You can divide the tefach. This is a different kind of tzuras HaPesach. This is a huge leniency for a sukkah, because a sukkah actually needs to be an enclosure, and it needs to provide not only shelter, but privacy. That's a big deal with the sukkah, privacy. So when we're learning that the tzuras HaPesach paradigm can work for the 3rd wall, as long as you have 2 real walls, or 2 real / sukkah walls, but it makes it a minimum for a sukkah, then in that case, the tzuras HaPesach has to be a little more dense. It has to have a little more meat on it. Only when it has a little more of an existence, only then can it be a tzuras HaPesach, which makes the sukkah different from everything else. And it has to be so. I could prove this to you on many levels, and this is expressed in the words of the Rishonim, and there's a whole thing from Reb Chaim Brisker on this, a whole beautiful, he has a beautiful way of framing this, and no pun intended, but that's the simplified version of what we're talking about here, is that the sukkah is not like everything else. There's something more going on here. I think Skippy has a question. Does a sukkah need 1 or 2 doors? A sukkah needs no doors, Skippy, technically. Although it would be a good idea to get into the sukkah. There's a difference of making the sukkah like the entrance to the Mishkan. The Mishkan would be a perfect sukkah enclosure, if that's your question. Not a door on one side and a door on the other side. You don't have to have doors on both sides. Most sukkahs tend to have a door, because you want to get into the sukkah, and as long as you can get in and out of the sukkah, I think you're fine. You don't need to have multiple doors, but you can have multiple doors, and you can have entrance and egress from different sides. Okay, this makes sense? That's version 1 of Rava's teaching. So Rava's teaching is tzuras HaPesach, the tefach we talked about, is not as previously imagined, as previously conceptualized, but the tefach that we talked about is not like wait less than 3 tefachim and put a tefach shechakas, but rather take these 2 tefachim and set them up as a tzuras HaPesach and put it on either edge of that wall, or the openings of that wall. Okay, you had a question? So now let's take a look at the second version of Rava's teaching. Ika Damri, like I told you to begin with, we're not even sure what Rava says. Even when he says something, we're not sure what he says, but we don't even know what he said. So there's another version. And it says like this, Amar Rava, Rava says, V'niteres nami b'tzuras HaPesach. Not that you have to turn the tefach into a tzuras HaPesach, but you have to add to what we talked about in the previous episode. You have to add to that a tzuras HaPesach in the rest of the empty area. Let's take a look at Rashi. Niteres nami, mashma. So the intimation here is the tefach sheshoninu, that the tefach that we talked about, hainu kedefrishis. This is as we explained it. Exactly the way we explained Kippurush earlier. Exactly what we talked about. A tefach shechakas, a little less than 3 tefachim from the edge. However, as Rabbi Simon taught it in what we learned about in our previous episode in the Gemara. Rabbi Simon said that you have to make a stima tefach, and you do it eitzal yotzei. At the end of this wall, if you have an extension of a tefach, you're good. V'asa Rava. And Rava comes along and says, no, it's more than that. Not only do you have to have the extension of the edge of the wall by adding a tefach, but furthermore, if you make the opening of the outline of a doorway at the rest of the wall, b'shnei konim, with 2 reeds. It doesn't have to be wide, it doesn't have to have any depth, it doesn't have to have just 2 reeds. And kon al gabeim, a reed on the top, koil el b'mokem tefach, you put it next to the tefach that we spoke about, umachshalei kavasei, and then it makes it kosher. So according to this opinion, in the first version, Rava is modifying. He's modifying the tefach. He says, no, the tefach is not the way you described it before. The tefach has to be divided, and it has to be turned into the image of a doorway. According to the second version, whatever we learned prior is just fine. But Rava is adding astringency. Rava is saying, and the rest of the open area has to have a doorway. So that way, it completes the rest of that third wall, conceptually at least. The E high sorry. Now we have a third opinion. In the third opinion, we're not going to be saying that a person needs, in addition to the teaching of Rabbi Simon, a person needs also a tzuras HaPesach attached to it. In the third opinion, we're going to say Ikadamni. Another opinion is Vitzricha. Sorry. Okay, that's 1 second. The second opinion is, the second version is like this. My apologies. The second version is, either it could have the tefach we talked about, or it could have a tzuras HaPesach. One or the other. So Rav is adding a new thing, a new understanding. The Brisa talked about a tefach, and he says, yeah, tefach works, or a tzuras HaPesach. And then Ikada Amri Amar Rava v'tzricha nami tzuras HaPesach. Not niteres nami. Not it works also with a tzuras HaPesach. It needs also a tzuras HaPesach. The third version is what I said before. The third, what I said as second is really the third. So that's the 3 versions. Let's go over this again. The 3 versions. In the first version, what we learned previously, the tefach has to be situated divided in half on 2 ends of the wall, with a reed across the top. That's what the previous image of the tefach, according to Rava, is wrong. You can use a tefach, but a tefach has to be comprising a tzuras HaPesach. Second version is, yeah, that works. You know what else would work? A tzuras HaPesach. Now you're going to say, what do you mean? Tzuras HaPesach always works. But as we learned, tzuras HaPesach does not always work by a sukkah. This is the novelty. Doesn't really spell it out in the Brisa. The Brisa doesn't say it. The Brisa talks about a tefach. Rav is saying, and I'm telling you, that here a tzuras HaPesach would work just like a tefach will work for the third wall. A tzuras HaPesach, an image of a door, will work to comprise a third wall as well. And then there's a third version, where Rav says, and this is what the halacha is actually, that we need to have the tefach and we need to have a tzuras HaPesach. And it's only both. So Rav is augmenting or adding to what we previously studied. So the Gemara now says, Rav Ashi, who is the next generation of Amoraic sages, Ashkecha Rav Kahana. He chanced on Rav Kahana. You know what? Before we go to Rav Ashi chancing Rav Kahana, I want to just do the Rashi on the third version. So in the second version, Rashi finishes off. He says, the oi hai machshir. Either it's going to be a tefach or it's going to be a tzuras HaPesach. In the third version, tzricha nami, not nami niteres, but tzricha nami. Not it also could be made kosher, also could be released into the world of sukkahs. But in order for it to be released into the world of sukkah, it also needs this extra element. So Rashi says, mashma the travayu bi'inan. Both are necessary. Tefach etzel hayoytze. There needs to be at the end of the wall, there needs to be a tefach. V'kone bezovis shekenegdei. And then there has to be another reed, in addition to the tefach. On the right side, on the left side, there has to be a reed. And guess what? V'kone shal gabeim. And then there has to be a reed on both. So you have a perpendicular wall that goes on the east and on the south. So you want to create a wall on the north or on the west. So what are you going to do? You're going to make a tefach. Oh, sorry. Let's go back to the alleyway, because there is an opinion. The Meiri and others say that it's talking about the perpendicular walls too. But let's keep it simple. So we have two parallel walls. We have an alleyway, and you want to create a third wall. So we learned, okay, no problem. You got to make a tefach, but the tefach has to be near the end of one, when they're one end, but within 3 tefachim of that one end. And that's good enough. So Rava said, yeah, it's good enough, provided that you'll be able to set up a reed at the other side, the other pole of the alleyway, and put a reed across the top. If you do that, then you're in good shape. Otherwise, you don't have a kosher sukkah. So the konesh al gabeim has to be, that's what essentially allows the sukkah wall to be fully expansive. You have what we call the beginnings of a wall. But in order to make that an actual wall, to make it considered an enclosure, it has to have something upon which to express itself. It has to have a frame. And then you imagine the frame to be filled, but there has to be something that frames it. When you have a frame, you can conceptually fill it in. When you have a beginning of a wall, it doesn't conceptually go to the end. Because where does it go to? But if you frame something, now it's contained within that frame, it's a doorway, that makes sense. So the Gemara says that Rav Ashi came to Rav Kahana, and he saw the Ka'ovid Tefach Shoichek. He was making this tefach, this open tefach. And then he saw that Rav Kahana was preparing a sukkah. I guess he came there before Sukkot. And he saw Ka'ovid Tzuras HaPesach. And then at the other side of his alley, he was building a doorway, the outlines of a doorway. So Amar Lei, Rav Ashi said, Rav Kahana, Loisavar Mar Lahod Rava? Do you not follow the opinion of Rava? That Rava says it would be good enough? So he says, the Amar Rava Niteres Nami B'Tzuras HaPesach. He invokes the second version. He says, Rava said one or the other. Either you have a tefach or you have a tzuras HaPesach, and you're doing both. Amar Le, he says, I do follow Rava, but my version of Rava is not your version of Rava. Ana ki idoch lishna de Rava. I follow the other version of Rava. At Svira Li, the Amar Rava, I believe that Rava's real teaching was V'tzricha Nami. Not niteret nami, not here's another way to do it, but rather you need also tzuras HaPesach. tzricha nami. And we can see over here that he's making a tefach shoichik, which follows the opinion, as Rashi says, of Rav Simon. And he says, I don't believe that it makes it permissible one way or the other. I believe it makes it permissible with both. And since this is the way Rav Kahana understood and implemented the halacha, and we know that halacha becomes really prominent and important when it's actuated, when it's followed upon, not just talked about in theory. So since Rav Kahana actually built a sukkah that way, this is the halacha of Shulchan Aruch. So if you make an alleyway, you got to make sure you have a tzuras HaPesach. If you have a tzuras HaPesach, you're good. Now, but you were correct in saying that most often a sukkah anyway has a tzuras HaPesach. That's true. Because most sukkot will be built in a manner of a frame in which you put schach on top. I'm just saying it doesn't always have to be that way. It doesn't always have to be quite that way, so we'd have to make sure that we actually have a tzuras HaPesach. And now you know. So now we have kind of continued to push this forward and have a better understanding of the conceptual walls of the sukkah. In a previous episode, we talked about the break in the wall. Now we're talking about the doorway. The doorway, what kind of doorway do we need? And in the end, the upshot is that for an alleyway, that's certainly the case, although we follow the approach that even when you have two perpendicular walls, you still need a bit of a tzuras HaPesach in order to make that a proper sukkah.
Can you have additional walls?
Can you have
Does 5 make it unkosher?
No. You can have as many walls as you want. So if you have many, many little walls that together comprise, the interesting discussion, which we're going to get to later on in the Masechet, is if you know the size of a sukkah, that's square, how would you fit that square footage into a round sukkah? And that's where it gets interesting. And that's, of course, that's a mathematical equation called pi. So the Tosfos talks about the mathematical equation called pi. And if you learn the Tosfos, you have to know math, because you have to know pi.
It doesn't violate halacha.
No, doesn't have to have four. You know, it's interesting. It's interesting. The Arizal would make a point of eating his meals on Shabbat and Yom Tov, and especially on Pesach, at a table with 4 legs. Even though a table could have today 1 leg or 3 legs. You know, there are all kinds of tables today. So why would he do that? Because the Arizal believed that the Shabbat table becomes the image of the Shulchan in the Mishkan. And therefore, he would want to sit at a table that had 4 legs, so it would have that image. But it was only on Shabbat. The pedestal tables are fine, he said, a whole week, but on Shabbat, I want to have it in that way. This is interesting because the challah is made also of different pieces of dough. It's braided together. If you have a 6 braid, 2 of them together represents 12 showbreads. So the Arizal had this teaching about making dafka sitting at a table. I don't know that our Rabbeim specifically or necessarily followed this or didn't. I mean, the table with the Rebbe would verbring on Shabbos did not have 4 legs. It was like a desk actually with the Rebbe would verbring. But at any rate, there's like a cube. That's about the table. But it's just interesting. So why am I sharing that with you? You said something that kind of jogged my look.
You have more walls.
Oh, you have more walls. So right. So I never ever saw that there's an emphasis on having 4 walls on a sukkah. I saw that there is an emphasis on having full enclosure in a sukkah.
Oh.
So if you make the enclosure round, so be it. But ideally, we should have it full enclosure. And why do we want to have full enclosure ideally? Because the sukkah, there's a concept of privacy in the sukkah. And we want to be able to achieve. Now, by the way, that doesn't preclude windows. It just means walls on all 4 sides. It doesn't preclude doorways. It just means that what we learn about here about a 4th wall that is non-extant altogether, and a 3rd wall that could comprise even just a small bit of a wall, that wall, that kula, that leniency is not the lechatchila thing necessarily to do. We try. Hasidim try to have a fully enclosed sukkah. But it doesn't, I mean, it's fully kosher without it. If you have 2 walls and a bit, works too.
Could you touch again on Marita Geshem, Marita Tal? You talked about the numerology and the mitzvahs overdoing.
I talked about the pasuk that we invoked.
This is supposed to protect the sukkah.
Right. Mizerem u'mimatar. Right. So zerem is reish mem zayin. Zerem is a rainstorm, and it's 247, and matar is rainfall, and it's 249. But how many positive mitzvahs are there? 248. Right. So there's this idea The Rebbe once taught that the sukkah gives us protection from inclement weather, so to speak. And the inclement spiritual weather is when people, chas v'shalom, try to add or subtract, take off. And that's basically the story of the extra wall. An igloo. If you would shave the ceiling off or the top off an igloo,
But you need the
and
area.
and you would put a wood frame on top, and then you would put schach, that would be a fully kosher sukkah. Probably a very cold sukkah, but it'd be a fully kosher sukkah. Yes, or you take a TP or whatever else like that, you did it, that would work just fine.
A Jewish Eskimo. I like it.
Who knew
Lost
there were
one.
Sukkot and none of it, huh? All right, thank you for joining us. Seid gesund und stark. And with Hashem's help, we'll be back.